I was working with some kids in Wales, in a very, very poor section of Wales. And there was a little boy in the class that never said anything. And on the third day, all of a sudden, he spoke during the story creation time. And later, this little chap came up to me and said, "Miss Karen Eve, you helped me find my voice. I thought I left it." And when I asked his teacher, it turned out that he had been found in the hull of a ship. He only spoke French, so he may have come from Senegal or French Guiana. No one knew. Completely alone in the hull of a ship. He was orphaned, he was being fostered, and he had not spoken in 4 years.
Wow.
And he spoke. He was a child of color. He spoke for the first time in that storytelling class. And I was so touched by this transition for him. Well, it was more than a transition. It was complete change that I started to focus more and more on storytellers and people who hadn't really had the opportunities either to perform or to be taught how to perform.
Welcome to our first episode of Do Tell, a storytelling podcast featuring great stories from great storytellers. I'm your host, Edwin Stepp. Our very first guest is the woman who conceived the idea for this podcast. She herself is an accomplished storyteller, the founder of STEAP Incorporated. That's STEAP, which stands for Storytelling, Education, and Arts Programs. The mission of STEAP is to connect communities with stories. They are dedicated to creating programs that widen social awareness and cultural appreciation across diverse communities. Karen Eve Bayne is an international businesswoman, former general manager of the London Philharmonic Orchestra, founder of the Do Tell Storyfest and STEAP Foundation. To be of service and make good things happen is her personal mission. As an impresario and implementer, she wants to think big and do the work while having fun. She has a successful career as a project manager and leader, committed to the richness of diversity and enhancing our communities. A native of Henderson County, North Carolina, and daughter of Everett and Lois Bayne, pillars in that community. Karen Eve is a performing artist, fiber artist, storyteller, mentor, and leader with a passion for connecting others to the arts and to their own passion and purpose. She does this by encouraging, coaching, mentoring, leading with compassionate hard work. Karen Eve enjoys making art, comfort foods, yoga, and gardening with her partner in Hendersonville, North Carolina. Karen Eve, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
It's great. Well, you have really you really have a successful, accomplished career, and I'm sure that engenders a lot of stories across all that experience. And you're from here in Western North Carolina, which is rich with all kinds of stories. You really have storytelling in your bones.
Yes, I do. Going back many, many generations to the Scottish Highlands, when my people came over in the 18th century to settle the Appalachian Mountains in Henderson County and in the Green River Valley.
As I understand it, that your family was one of the first to come into these mountains.
Yes, we were. There were 5 or 6 first families, and they divided the land up, and we received a land grant. The Baynes, Johnson Bayne, received a land grant down in the Green River Valley, and he came from Aberdeen, Scotland.
Wow. So did he come directly from Aberdeen to this region, or did the family kind of, like my family came into Virginia first and then eventually succeeding generations wound up here?
We believe he came directly here. There were 3 brothers that left Scotland together, and they arrived in Virginia at one of the ports there. And one of the brothers went to Texas, one stayed in Virginia, and the records say that Johnson made his way to the Carolinas.
Right. We had a little joke in our family that they came into these mountains probably because they were running from something. They got in trouble with the law or something.
Oh, my people were. These 3 brothers were banished from Scotland. Their lands were seized. Their money was taken, and they were escorted to a ship bound for the colonies.
That's great.
They were probably Jacobites, is what I figure.
Yeah, right. That's quite a common story. There was a lot of political upheaval in those days in England, and if you were on the wrong side, you had a good chance of losing your head.
Yes,
So
yes.
you got out, or you were forced out. Some
Yes.
of it, like you said,
Yes.
they were banished. Well, tell us more about your early background growing up here in Henderson County.
Well, I grew up in the Green River Valley in a working class family on a working farm. My father was also a bricklayer, and we had a family farm, so we raised all our vegetables, our chickens and meats and cattle and pigs and all those things. So I grew up working on a farm and working in the fields. And it was a great way to grow up. Really enjoyed that lifestyle. Heard a lot of stories from a lot of old mountain people. I was not particularly enamored with it as a young person, of course. I was always ready to get out and get going, go somewhere more exciting. But grew up with storytelling and all of the arts and crafts of Appalachia, making soap, quilting, canning, preserving foods, all those things. My mother and grandmother did all those, and those were passed on to me as well as working on the farm.
Yeah, it's great that they pass those on because they are dying arts, I think. They seem to be having somewhat of a revival now
Yes.
with the younger people wanting to find those, to get back to those skills and crafts. And I know the STEAP has encouraged some of that as well. So
Yes, yes, we do.
So you had this desire to, even though you had an appreciation for Western North Carolina and Henderson County, but you realized there was a bigger world out there, and you were ready to go and see
Yes.
it, I sense.
I was in love with books and stories as a young child, and I would work in the field and get all my beans and corn and everything picked. And I had books stashed in a bag at the end of the row, and I would take those down to the Green River and sit under the bridge and read until all the other kids caught up with their work, and then I'd run back, and that's how I got to read a lot of books. And my mom was the first person to get the bookmobile to come down into the Green River Valley, and she got that to come to Cedar Springs Church, Baptist Church. And I would go down every month and get as many books as they would let me check out. So I discovered the world by being in Green River, reading books and reading stories. So my head was filled with stories and places to go, things to do, history, future. So I wanted to get out there.
Yeah. Was there any particular part of the world or history that really appealed to you more than others?
I was very enamored with the Arthurian legends and absolutely fascinated with England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales, and so many of the stories that I heard, and ballads, of course, came from there. And then I was lucky enough to eventually be able to work in the UK. But the Arthurian legends were something that I just was very fascinated with, and mythology in general. When I was in the 5th grade, I discovered mythology because Mrs. Catherine Taylor started teaching Roman and Greek mythology, and I adored it. And it happened that year for Christmas, she gave all the kids a gift, and I already had the U.S. puzzle that she was giving to everyone, so she gave me a book of Roman and Greek mythology, and I still have it.
Wow, yeah. Mm-hmm. Those are fascinating stories, sometimes very dark.
Yes, yes.
And, you know, the gods were more human than we were, I think, in their vices.
Yes, indeed.
But definitely those stories inspired literature and stories through the years. So there's something very compelling about them, but that's interesting.
And I always thought that they were a great explanation of why and how people act out, and why there were certain characters in our real life. And later I went on to study the psychology of storytelling, and I see that this was a way in mythology to have all the gods and goddesses that represented different characters and virtues and vices to explain who we are as human beings.
Right.
Great technique for doing that.
Yeah, and that's the power of storytelling, is to give us meaning, to understand our world. And of course it's changed and we've become a little enlightened since those days, but it still serves the same purpose.
It does.
So storytelling is very powerful. So you were fascinated with the British Isles, and you wind up there. Is that just a coincidence, or did you set your goal and your sights on?
Well, it was a coincidence on one hand. When I finished undergraduate and I was working in Asheville, and then I took a job with a congressional member. And when his term was up, I was looking for a job. I wanted to stay in D.C. And I started to apply, and I got a job with a small telecommunications company that was owned by a large company that was headquartered in London in the UK. And I remember at the time thinking, whoa, maybe this is my chance. It took 10 years to transfer to the UK, and I was the first woman, and as the Brits say, the first indigenous personnel, that they moved to the London headquarters. So in a way, I guess I set my cap for it, and another way, it was the fact I was willing to take a risk and go.
Right.
Yeah, put my hand up to go.
Yeah, that is a big risk, coming from a small little, not even a town, the Green River Valley, up to the biggest city and most cosmopolitan city in the world. So, what was that like?
It was terrifying. It was exciting. Everyone said, "But what if it doesn't work out?" And I thought, well, if it doesn't work out, I'll just come back. That's what I'll do. I knew how to work hard, and if I needed to stack cans in a grocery store, I could do that. Because certainly growing up on a farm in western North Carolina, hard work was something I was used to, physical work. And I thought it was just this great opportunity to go there and have this international job based out of this town, this city that had lived in my mind since I was a little girl and probably read The Matchstick Girl.
Right.
Something like that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So many stories coming out of that region. So you're fairly young at this point. Mm-hmm. You weren't married yet. You were single?
I was married. Yeah. I was in my early 30s. I'd just gotten married. And it happened that my husband had studied English history, so he was quite keen to go. So we were both in our 30s, and we went over to the UK for a 2 or 3 year assignment, and 15 years later, I moved back. And during that period of time, I worked for a company, Cable and Wireless, which was a telecommunications company. And, it was a great experience. Did a lot of international business. And my husband worked there. He passed about 5 years into this 15-year period. Mm-hmm. And we had a child, my daughter, Allison. So we were living in the UK when that happened. And I had taken a career break to study theology. So I was at Trinity College when my husband passed, and I just took a semester off. But it was there that I discovered really the art of storytelling. But just prior to that, our daughter was born, Allison, in 1995, and I was transitioning from working at Cable and Wireless to a temporary assignment by the chairman of Cable and Wireless, Lord Young. He was also the chair of the London Philharmonic, and he wanted someone to take over the general management of the orchestra because they were struggling. So it was decided that after my maternity leave, I would go to the London Philharmonic. And it was during my maternity leave, I had come home to North Carolina because I was 38 years old. I was a late mother, a professional mother. And I had this little 5-month-old baby that I was so enamored with. And I went to some good friend's house. And my friend Heather Nicely had told me she had just gotten a master's degree in storytelling. And I was fascinated by this. And as I did, I said, well, what is that? I understand folklore, but what is storytelling? So Heather told the story. It's referred to as the King Arthur and the Green Knight, or sometimes the Black Knight, or King Arthur and Gavin. But this story changed everything for me. And the basic storyline of this Arthurian story is that King Arthur is captured by a rival monarch. He's imprisoned for a year. And if he can answer the question, what do women really want, at the end of that year, he will get his freedom. And in the meantime, his best friend Gavin has to marry a very revolting witch. And there's a great turn to that story. So this story really settled with me, and I carried it back with me. And that's when I started realizing the power of storytelling, that it's very transformative. I'd heard that story before. However, it really spoke to me then. And I was thinking, I'm 38. I'm doing really well in my career. I'm about to go take this dream job with the London Philharmonic. Is this what I really want? Because having children changes a person. And I could see the projection of my career at cable and wireless. And this really stayed with me. Is this what I really want long term? And that fall, when I went back to take the new job at the orchestra, I also took a class in the psychology of storytelling. And that was really powerful for me. I don't know how I did that now, looking back with a baby and a new job and all that. But, that was a lot of years ago. And it set me on this different path of questioning, did I just want to bring better telecommunications to the world? I mean, great thing to do, but did I want that on my tombstone? She brought better communication to the world. And it really made me think about what was very powerful in life. And from there, my husband and I moved so I could go to Trinity College. And we moved to Gloucestershire. And I took an evening course in storytelling in this 500-year-old mill that used to make the red wool for the redcoats. And a Scottish storyteller stood up and told a story, and that was it. I had it right then. That was like, this is my raison d'etre. This is what I'm meant to do. Yeah. And that's 25, 6, 7, 8 years ago, so I haven't looked back.
That's great. Well, and that's another brave step for you, because you had a probably very secure, pretty high-paying job, I imagine, and now you're going to go off and just tell stories.
Tell stories and battle with the great theological questions of the main religions of the world.
Right.
And I was 42, had a 3-year-old. It was a big step, but it came down to my time or my life. That's what it really came down to. I had a bit of a crisis in the job. It was just all too much to handle with everything I was doing. And I was having trouble looking myself in the eye every day, because I was being asked more and more often in business to do things that I thought were ethically unsound, to say the least. And it was a lot of pressure. So I decided I would take a career break, and it was a complete break. I never went back to big business.
Yeah, wow, that's very inspiring, and you've shown that you're showing that it is possible to reject those pressures to do something unethical and find another way and survive. Not only survive, but flourish.
Yes, and I was very fortunate because my late husband, Ed Fotzer, was really supportive. He said as long as we could live somewhere in a village and I could commute to college, that would be great. And he found another job, and it was great. I very appreciated that. And I would often get interviewed about, oh, you've left this limelight, etc. So but I have my life back, I have my time back, and I am doing something that I think is very worthwhile.
Right. Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time consulting, and then also teaching preachers how to use storytelling in different religions. Lots of ways to use stories because stories they're transferable, they're memorable, they're educational. All the great masters have used stories to teach lessons.
Yeah. Storytelling is really in everything that succeeds.
Yes.
Even into, I did some time as in marketing and advertising, and the best marketing and advertising is telling the best stories and convincing people to buy the product. Not always for the best reasons, but it's there. And as we've pointed out in the podcast, storytelling is in art as well. Paintings, murals,
music,
mosaics,
everything.
Music, poetry. So it doesn't just exist as being told orally or in a written form.
And it seems the word storytelling is being used more and more now. Some of the podcasts I listen to will say, well, this is about science and storytelling. This is about relationships and storytelling. Or the storytelling in this series, this film is about. And a lot of film directors call themselves storytellers now.
Right. That's true. I've seen that. I think you're absolutely right. So you leave the cable and wireless, which means you also leave the Philharmonic.
Yes.
Because that was under their,
yes,
at least associated somehow. Do you have any stories about the Philharmonic when you were working there? Any interesting interactions with?
Well, I think one of the fun things were all the well-known musicians that I got to work with, and the playlist and the program is set usually years in advance based on a musician's availability. So I did not influence the playlist or the concert series that year, those years that I was there in 95 and 96. However, I got to meet a lot of people. And I remember there was a bit of a battle because I was managing the business and the personnel. The orchestra had its director, but the business had to carry on. And I was doing a lot of negotiations with the trade unions and things like that. And we had hired Yo-Yo Mao to come. And I was quite tight-fisted about the budget because we were about to go under. And I remember that he required a first-class ticket for his instrument to be in the seat next to him. And I was like, whoa, is this going to happen with everyone? He was a very lovely man.
Well, you're going to kind of understand he wanted to protect that instrument. But
and it happened that the year I moved to the London Philharmonic, I think a woman took over Covent Garden Opera Center and maybe the London Ballet. So there were 3 women in 3 key positions. And the BBC did a series, I don't know if it was ever actually produced, called The New Broom, to look at how women were going to change these organizations. So that was interesting to have someone follow me around.
Yeah, I kind of have an idea what that means, new broom, but I'm not certain. Tell me what that meant, do you think?
Well, was it going to be a clean sweep? Were we going to clean house? I thought it was interesting that they used that female related metaphor.
Right.
I don't think a man going in would have been given a new broom. Yeah, but it was to really look at what we were going to change, how we were going to do things differently, that sort of thing.
I can't help but think of the witch's broom either.
I know.
Not just sweeping the house, but boy, there was a lot of double entendre in that one. Wasn't there? Yeah. The BBC, so clever. Yeah. Okay, so how did you make your way back to the States and when? And tell us.
Well, I left cable and wireless in the London Phil and went to Trinity College and studied there for a while. My husband passed during that time, and I took a couple of years to do a master's degree, and frankly left with more questions than I had arrived with. But during that time, I had started doing storytelling and performing in pubs and wine bars and places where adults gathered. I did school stuff too as well, but primarily I was very interested in adult storytelling. with the more complex stories and characters. And I had a storytelling partner there. We were the Midnight Storytellers, a British woman and I. And we did that for a number of years. And then when I was 49, the year I was going to turn 50, I woke up one day and I thought, I don't want to die out of my home country. I don't know why that suddenly was important to me. I had a daughter who was 11 years old, so she was about to go into middle school here. And I knew if I was going to move and get her in the U.S. school system, this was the time. And I had read a book where it brought up a question about, will you act like this is your only life? And I thought, well, it is my only life. And I knew that some place, it was either a person, a place, or a profession was calling me. And it was the mountains of North Carolina. I didn't think I would come back here, but it was the mountains, and I thought, I can find a profession, and I'm the person. So there. So I brought my daughter, and we moved back.
Right back to Henderson County.
Yes, on the opposite side of the county from where I grew up, but still it's a small county, so
Yeah.
everyone still knew my name.
And what did you do there professionally when you came back?
Well, for a number of years I did some consulting, and then I had trained also to be a counselor, and I worked at Grace Lutheran Church as the director of gifts, which is really volunteer organization. And then I did a lot of personality assessments and life coaching for people there.
Right, got it. So the theology degree, tell us a little bit more about why you pursued that. What drove you to say, I want to really plunge into this?
Well, I had grown up Mountain Baptist and gone away from the church. And when I was in the UK, I used to catch a bus opposite the Anglican church at Highbury Fields. And I was very taken in by the music. And I started to attend there, and I discovered liturgy. And I've always been in love with words. I have kept journals of phrases and sentences since I was a teenager. And I just fell in love with the words of the liturgy and the fact that they were so old and had been used for so many generations. And this raised a lot of new theological questions for me. I mean, looking back on it, it was the story and the words that drew me in. Because I had been having these ethical and moral dilemmas about business and how business was kept very separate from people's values. I was really struggling with that. So I decided that I would go study the big questions. And the UK was a great place to do that. Some very ecumenical universities. I mean, certainly studying theological studies there covered all fields, all religions, all of that. So it was not just specifically Christianity. And that was a great grounding for me. And I remember once that I was telling some stories in a pub on a regular basis. And I had prepared this story by a rabbi, and it was about the nature of good and evil. And I was also at this point in a theological course where there's always this question, are you going to be ordained or not ordained? And I wasn't particularly interested in being ordained. It was the knowledge I wanted. And I thought, well, should I go for ordination? You know, I look good in purple, so why not? You know, let's go for it.
That's another big draw for the Episcopal or the Anglican Church is the robes and everything.
Yes. Oh, yeah, the costuming is great. And I thought, well, let me just check this out. And I had one of the very few, as it's called, a word of knowledge, meaning from the big guy upstairs or big girl upstairs, lady upstairs, that said, well, tell your story in the pub and see what you think. So I told this story, and my partner, storytelling partner, didn't think this was a cool story to tell. about the devil, and I used a mask. It's a very dramatic story. And I went up to the bar later to have a glass of wine, and some people came up and they were like, well, do you really believe in good and evil? And I had all of these big moral questions that were being thrown at me in a pub, wine bar actually. And I thought, well, this is it. I discovered that theological studies and my studies in psychology and sociology had really been the grounding for my knowledge, and that storytelling is the medium that I excelled in and was very fascinated with.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You put together those resources and, as you say, the medium of conveying that knowledge in an interesting way rather than just a dry, scholastic way.
And I had grown up as a 4-H'er and done a lot of demonstrations, and that was always about public speaking and storytelling as well. So looking back, I see that there was this theme that goes back to my childhood.
You must have had to present a lot too in the professional world you were in. So that's another good training ground in a little slightly different way, but still you have to hold people's attention if you're going to convey it. Okay, well, let's come back to Henderson County. You're back here. You're finding ways to use that knowledge and your storytelling to help people, counseling, and with the Grace Lutheran Church. Let's fast forward a bit to the concept for the STEAP.
Well, Do Tell came before that, the Storytelling Festival. And I went to Jonesboro to one of the early storytelling festivals about year 10, and we're now into 40 years at Jonesboro.
Just so our listeners know, I'm sure most of them know, but Jonesboro, Tennessee is the home of the International Storytelling Festival. And it's a huge event. But anyway.
And I attended that once or twice, and I was so excited about seeing these amazing storytellers. And in particular, on Sunday, they call it sacred telling, and it's not necessarily religious and sacred, but it's stories about change and hope and inspiration. And they're very powerful. And I carried those stories with me. And I also attended the Transylvania County Storytelling event that they had at the library for many years. And I saw several hundred people come together to listen to storytellers. And I thought, Henderson County can do this. We can do this. So I looked into how to fund it. And I had introduced myself to the Arts Council, being a great supporter of the arts, and discovered that I could apply for a grant to put on a storytelling festival. So we put on our first one, I think it was 2009, and featured Louise Bailey, who had, of course, written stories for 40 years, I believe, as a column writer in the Times News, our local newspaper, and she had been the secretary to Carl Sandburg, the poet,
who had a home here in Henderson County.
Yes, and I also was a park ranger at his house to put myself through college. So that's what I did, is I worked there in the summer and quoted poetry and told stories about him and led tours. So I guess I've been a storyteller in some form for a long time. So Louise came, and we had hundreds of people turn out to hear Louise Bailey. It was in the old courthouse, and they had storytellers all over. It was a great event. And the Arts Council loved it, so it was a success, and I was encouraged to do that for a couple of years. So we got funding so we could pay our artists. And then in 2012, I realized that if I created a nonprofit, that then we could receive the funding direct. I've always had to go through basically a fiduciary.
Fiscal sponsor.
Yeah, fiscal sponsor, exactly. A fiscal sponsor who would accept the money and then give it to us for the storytelling event. So I came up with this idea of storytelling, education, and arts programs and created STEAP. And when I was first contemplating the Storytelling Festival, I was telling my daughter about it, She was a teenager, and she says, "Well, do tell. How's that going to work?" And I was like, "Whoa, do tell." That's it, because that's a pretty common phrase.
Right.
And I thought, since she was an international kid from two continents, and she knew that phrase, so we named it Do Tell. And then STEAP grew out of the need to be our own physical agent, and we did the Storytelling Festival for a number of other years. In 2020, we had grants to go into schools, have a festival, etc., but we can't. It's
COVID.
April and May and COVID. And I met a young man whom you know, Bruno, Cecita Carrasca, and Bruno is 17 years old, and I met him at the Story Slam for the Carl Sandburg competition, and Bruno won third place. And I was always on the lookout for young storytellers, a young, very bright Hispanic kid, and he was very interested in doing some work with STEAP. And he convinced me that with his iPhone, he could do some films that were stories that would fulfill the grant requirement to tell the stories in a non-public forum. So we moved from oral storytelling in person to presenting stories on film for several middle schools, elementary schools, and the library. So we together came up with a way for storytellers to film their work, and Bruno did some storytelling, and then that's led to our involvement with producing films, STEAP's involvement with producing films.
Right. You're developing a series about artists in the area.
Yes, we call it our AAA. It's Amazing Appalachian Artists. And we think that'll be out in 2025, early 2025, a series about surprising artists in this area that don't meet the normal profile, that are diverse, both in ethnicity and also in art form.
Yeah. And that has become a big part of the mission at STEAP, is to seek out artists in underserved communities. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, I have always had a real heart for those individuals that haven't had access to more training or more opportunities. Part of that comes from my own working class background and feeling that social divide of things that weren't available to me. And then when I was working in the UK, doing a lot of storytelling, and for a number of years I was the storyteller for the Western Burt Arboretum, I was working with some kids in Wales, in a very, very poor section of Wales. And there was a little boy in the class that never said anything. And on the third day, all of a sudden, he spoke during the story creation time. And later, this little chap came up to me and said, "Miss Karen Eve, you helped me find my voice. I thought I left it." And when I asked his teacher, it turned out that he had been found in the hull of a ship. He only spoke French, so he may have come from Senegal or French Guiana. No one knew. Completely alone in the hull of a ship. He was orphaned, he was being fostered, and he had not spoken in 4 years.
Wow.
And he spoke. He was a child of color. He spoke for the first time in that storytelling class. And I was so touched by this transition for him. Well, it was more than a transition. It was complete change, that I started to focus more and more on BIPOC children and storytellers and people who hadn't really had the opportunities either to perform or to be taught how to perform.
Right, right. Wow, that's really an inspiring story, and tugs at the heartstrings for sure, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, well, that's you now, STEAP. But tell us more about STEAP, where it is right now, what's on the agenda.
So our real mission is to connect our communities with stories, with our stories. And it's often been said that the shortest distance between two people is a story. Once you know their story, you know that person. You have compassion, understanding. And during this period in American history, we have a lot of division. We have a lot of demonization of other cultures, other people. And to live up to my personal mission of to do good things and make good things happen, very simple, we started to look at how could we bring communities together. And the first step was we started to employ Black and Hispanic storytellers and mentor those people who've done really great. And then also doing the storytelling through films. We had Bruno, a Hispanic filmmaker and director. He had a different eye, a different community that he connected us with. And then it struck me that storytelling, of course, happens in art. And I learned a long time ago that in almost any art gallery in the world, if you understand mythology and Old Testament stories, you could get most of the paintings in most of the European art museums. So that was stories all over again. So we started to look into how could we illustrate our stories. And that led to the development of murals, of art in murals. And specifically, the Community Foundation had a grant in 2022 for 40th anniversary, and we applied for 2 murals and another public art project in the 7th Avenue community of Hendersonville, which has traditionally been our Black community, because we still had a division. And we began working very closely with our Black brothers and sisters there, with Debbie Roundtree, the councilwoman, with local businessmen and women, attending the community events where that community gathered. So it's primarily a Black and brown community. Asking them, what do you want? We've gotten some money. Vote on these murals. We're going to use diverse artists. We want these murals to represent what you want in this community. So the first 2 murals that we have installed are done by 2 Black artists from this area, and each of them highlight Black and brown people in some way. They're inclusive. One has a rainbow in it, as well as apples and bears and all the things that represent our city and our county. And I was painfully aware that there were no pieces of public art, to my knowledge, that had Black and brown people in it. So there's loads of sociological and psychological information that says we need positive images of ourselves. And Billy Smith proposed a great mural. He took the input from the community on what they would like to see. It was first a farm scene, and now it's an urban scene of these beautiful, happy children playing on 7th Avenue. Mm-hmm. And then again, Diamond Cash created a mural of a brown and white hand clutched in front of all the symbols of our city. And I remember so clearly that the peoples in the 7th Avenue community pointed to that one, because they voted on 5 or 6. They pointed to that one and said, this is what we want our future to be, that we are clasping hands. And I was very touched by that, so I'm very happy that we've installed that mural.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we will have upcoming episodes featuring both those artists, and they will tell you about their background, their careers, and also specifics about those particular murals, which you can see they're installed in the town. And STEAP, I understand, wants to do more of this as time and resources allow.
Yes, we have a mural. We've installed one in June, which celebrates our Hispanic community. And we have received funding for 2 more. One will celebrate our agricultural and horticulture history and future, which will be very interesting to see that developed. And then another one that will represent the full diversity of our county. I'm still looking for buildings to put those on, but the city is very keen to do those.
Yeah.
And we've gotten a lot of support from a lot of locations.
That's great. So listeners, if you have any ideas, suggestions, please get in touch. If you have a nice building.
STEAP.net. Go to STEAP.net and you'll see my name and phone number on there.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to be asking each of our guests if they have a particular story that inspired them, encouraged them, motivated them, brought them to tears, and influenced them in some major way. And I know you must have probably hundreds of these, but do you have one that you want to share with us today?
Well, the one that kicked me off was, of course, King Arthur and the Witch. But this particular story is based in truth, in fact, and it's the story of Itzhak Perlman. In 1995, Itzhak Perlman was going to perform in New York City. I was with the London Philharmonic and I wanted to see him. And Perlman had polio as a child, and so to watch him walk on the stage, particularly in the 90s, was very painful. He would go across, click, click, click with his crutches and then sit down and bend over, and you'd hear click, click as he undid his braces on his legs. And he'd reach over and get his violin, and everything was quiet, completely still, and Mr. Perlman would nod to the orchestra leader, the director, and off they'd go. And so Perlman is just singing and playing with his violin and his bow. It's just magnificent. And suddenly there's bing! And that is the sound of a broken string. Now, Perlman did something that day, which was amazing. He decided not to believe what is a fact. Most people believe it's a fact in the music world that you cannot play a violin with 3 strings. But he refused to believe that. He waited a while and no one brought him another violin. Everything was quiet. And suddenly he picked up his bow and he began to play his violin. Now the conductor was completely lost. He had no idea what to do. But Perlman just nodded to him, and the bow on this violin just danced and twirled, and it sang out its own tune and melody. And Perlman was basically composing as he played. And the orchestra did its very best to follow. And the audience was amazing. They were just tense and quiet. And this performance was outstanding. I mean, outstanding among some of his finest work ever. And when he finished, he put his bow in his lap. Everything became silent for about 3 seconds. And the entire audience just stood up and burst. It was like drums going off, the clapping, the stomping of feet. Everybody was so happy, and it went on and on and on. And then Perlman picks up his bow and he raises it up in the air. And he says, "There, there." And everyone quietens down. And the great Itzhak Perlman says, "Sometimes the job of the artist is to make music with whatever you have left."
That's fantastic.
And I've always been inspired because certainly age gives us things and takes things away. You know, all of us have lost things over the years. And it just always reminds me that our job is just to keep making music, no matter whether we have 1 string, 2 strings, or 4 strings.
Yeah, oh, that is really a great story. Gives little chills up my spine here listening to that. I know a little bit about music, and I know that you can get most all the notes on 3 strings. Depends on which one broke. But most all the notes are there. But for him to be able to, in his mind, know where to go without that 4th string is really an amazing thing.
And for him to compose that very wise sentence at the end.
Right.
He did not have to quieten everybody down. He could have walked out and it would have been a great success. But I think his closing was the most powerful part.
Yeah, that's true. What a lesson. Well, Karen Eve, it's such a delight to talk to you. Every time I sit down with you, we have a conversation. I learn something. I'm motivated. I'm inspired. And I am so appreciative of the work you're doing for our community here, Henderson County, and beyond. It's going to go beyond, I think. So keep up that good work. I'm amazed at how much you get done with all the things that are on your plate. And I know there's a lot on your plate.
Well, I think when we find a vocation that's our avocation, that we really love doing, there's just boundless energy, despite popping a few strings.
We'll have to end with that.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much, Karen Eve. And thank you for conceiving of this podcast. Listeners out there, subscribe and tell all your friends about it. You're going to hear some great stories over the next few weeks and years.
Yes.
Thank you again, Karen.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Do Tell, a storytelling podcast. We hope you were inspired by the stories today's guests shared with us. Please tell all your friends and acquaintances about our series, offering great stories from great storytellers in all art forms and media. We are on a mission to create communities and bridge divides with these inspiring and motivational tales. Thanks so much to our sponsor, the Henderson County Tourism Development Authority, based in Hendersonville, North Carolina, a picturesque mountain town tucked away in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where every visit is not just an adventure-filled sightseeing experience, but an immersion into the heart of Southern charm. For more info, check out their website at visithendersonvillenc.org. Thanks also to the nonprofit STEAP Incorporated, STEAP, which stands for Storytelling, Education, and Arts Programs. STEAP's motto is Connecting Communities with Stories, and they are dedicated to creating programs that widen social awareness and cultural appreciation across diverse communities. Learn more about STEAP at steep.net. Please like, follow, and subscribe to the podcast and help us continue to connect those communities.